One man obliterates one holy knight, whilst another man protects two babies, and a third man goes fishing for 3 future emperors of the sea. Very big fishies. Because yes, lots of men are doing lots of manly things that will ultimately culminate in the necessity to disappear God Valley from all of history. This chapter is really cool because it's sort of like a superhero origin story for Dragon. You know how in every origin story there's that part where the hero puts on like a prototype of the final suit they'll eventually get, a draft to test the waters? Well, that is what Dragon does in this chapter. In order to remain hidden and as anonymous as possible, and in order to not be wearing the bright blues and whites of the Marines, Dragon finds himself a cloak, and this becomes the beta test for the revolutionary that he would go on to become. I don't know if it's the same cloak that he still wears in the modern day. They do look a bit different, and it could actually be a standard issue Marine cloak. It's not uncommon to see Marines wearing this kind of gear, particularly in cold climates like not God Valley, but like what we saw with the G5 Marines on Punk Hazard. But imagine for a second if the origin of this cloak was that Dragon had to take it from someone on God Valley. Like he had to disrobe the corpse of someone who had been hunted. Dark stuff, but every time he wears it, it would be like a reminder of what happened on that day, and a sense of the will of God Valley being carried on. In the same sort of way that the Straw Hat carries on the will of D, or Chopper's hat carries on the will of Dr. Herolook. Although we do know that Dragon does take a while to fully set into this form. During his time as a freedom fighter, Dragon had a very different outfit, but at some stage the freedom fighters became the full-on revolutionary army, and Dragon adopted the cloak look again. So maybe the freedom fighters were a more optimistic group, but as they saw more and more, they realized that this was a much more dire situation and a very dire solution was required. And even if it isn't the same one, I have to imagine that Dragon has about the same feeling whilst wearing it, the feeling that he needs to do whatever he can, however little that may be, and for those small ripples to grow and become much larger forces of red-headed good in the future. But that's for the not now. For now, we've got tragedy. Lots and lots of tragedy. One Piece flashbacks are always soul-crushingly depressing in one way or another, and I know that narrative kick in the metaphorical nutsack is what we need to make our eventual victory feel all the more better. But sometimes, you know, I just really want to get in there and just make a small change to see how the world would have turned out. Like taking Higarashi's deception out of the fight between Odin and Kaido, or maybe advising a young Trafalgar Law to not trust this suspiciously Virgo-shaped Marine. And as it turns out, I can now do exactly that. With the sponsor of this video, Fableverse, and keep watching till the end for a chance to win a $100 Amazon, Steam, or Crunchyroll gift card. But Fableverse is a free platform on voice.me where you can chat with your favorite anime and manga characters, rewrite canon and what-if stories, and play RPG adventures with your own character, your story, your world. With Fableverse, you can instantly hop into immersive and interactive stories featuring characters all across the anime spectrum and engage in wild what-if scenarios like what if Sanji joined Blackbeard's crew? He'd be making a lot of cherry pies, that's what had happened. But hey, at least he'd get to reunite with Charlotte Pudding and the two of them can finally be together forever in Pirate Prison. But the greatest thing about Fableverse to me is that with the C feature, you can generate phenomenal anime visuals to truly bring your story to life. And there is something for every anime fan. You've got action, romance, comedy, and all of the other genres. There's lots, so many. And I also love the sheer freedom that you have to make your own decisions, rewrite anime canon, and experience the limitless options of your own creativity. So you can and should check out Fableverse through my link in the description. And for a limited time, Fableverse is hosting a giveaway. Simply start a story and send at least one message in the Fable chat for a chance to win one of 5 $100 gift cards. And just make sure that you're logged in so that your entry counts. So definitely check it out. I've been having a lot of fun with this. And just go ahead, hit that start story button. But for now, it's back to you. Me. Thanks, me. And unfortunately, perhaps fortunately in this chapter, Dragon is forced to learn a pretty tough lesson that would go on to serve him all throughout his life. And that lesson is that you can't save everyone. And sometimes you can do frustratingly little, but the little you can do is still worth doing. As Dragon is attacked by one of the holy knights that were introduced in the last chapter, whose name is Saint Mafi. And before we continue all of the things that happened here, I was convinced that she was the mother of Saint Gillingham, but that may not be the case as they do not share family names. Gillingham is from the Rimoshifu family, whilst Mafi appears to come from the Satchel family. Another new family, by the way. And I do love the way that she's smoking whilst holding Shamrock. There's something very crocodile about it, or something very croco-mum about it. Her abilities are a little bit crazy though, as Mafi seems to have originated from the Dragon Ball universe by flat out shooting an energy beam from her mouth, very Piccolo-esque. However, this isn't unheard of in One Piece, it's just unheard of in canon One Piece. In One Piece, the movie, which released in the year 2000 and featured the Straw Hats before Sanji had even joined the crew, the villain of that film's name was El Dorado, and he had a devil fruit called the Goe-Goe-no-Mi, and all that allowed him to do was create destructive sound waves from his mouth that appeared as energy beams. And I do believe that in One Piece film Red, Howling Gab does something similar. However, the director of that film did state that they had inserted fake attacks for the Red Hair Pirates so that their actual abilities wouldn't be spoiled. So this could be Oda deciding to use El Dorado's fruit or Howling Gab's whatever. And I will say that Mafi's beam is much more refined, much more targeted. And if she appeared in the modern day, I would suspect that she was a cyborg before jumping to devil fruit user. But I feel like unless Saint Saturn's been doing his own thing with science and such, God Valley is a bit too early for that kind of technology to be popping up. Regardless, Mafi blows straight the crap through Dragon's arm, causing him to fumble some babies. And like that, we've lost a child, which I guess I assume is Shamrock. I don't actually know how we tell them apart once we start mixing them up, but Dragon is saved in a classic Will of D style by an act of fate. At the very moment that Mafi is about to kill him, an attack from Whitebeard comes conveniently blasting through, causing some very friendly collateral damage. And this is one of my favorite panels of the chapter. This shot of a regular human dragon looking up at Whitebeard and Big Mom as they come storming onto the battlefield. The scale is incredible, and it puts Dragon in a very Luffy-like position. One of the reasons why the One Piece world and its inhabitants are just big by default is because Oda wants to keep Luffy feeling like the underdog. So he generally wants Luffy to be on the smaller end of the spectrum, and he's used the same principle here with Dragon, who in the modern day is much bigger. But what he did here also works because even Saint Mafi is huge, colossal compared to him. And this whole scenario reminds me of a line I love from Jujutsu Kaisen, where a character realizes just how ill-equipped he is to deal with what's happening around him, and he describes the situation as elephants tap dancing on ants. In this situation, Dragon is the ant, desperately trying to survive underneath all of these tap dancing elephants. And while yes, it is painful to lose Shamrock, Dragon demonstrated his special ability here, an ability that was not inherited by Luffy, which is Dragon's sheer pragmatism. He knows that Shamrock is now a lost cause, and Dragon has now put his full effort into saving Shanks, to save this one life to atone for his actions on this island. Again, Dragon has realized that he cannot do much, but what little he can do is still worth risking his life for, as well as the lives of his other platoon mates apparently. But Oda draws baby Shanks pretty hilariously given the situation in this chapter. He's hit his head, he has a big comical lump, and also he's got X's on his eyes. And mate, it is a pretty big bump. And to bring Dragon Ball back into things, I'm hoping that this isn't a Goku kind of situation where hitting his head drastically changed his personality, and that is how Goku became the good-natured person he is today. Without hitting his head, he would have grown up to be a violent alien who tried to take over the world. And so I really do hope that the only difference between Shanks and Shamrocks are the environments in which they were raised. I think it's a very nice touch that the Rocks pirates are arguing with each other while all of this is happening. They still don't work very well together as a team, and I guess never will, but they're all individually so powerful that it just doesn't matter. So they're like elephants tap dancing, but they've all got their own individual routines. They're not working as an ensemble. However, I think I may have just read one of the dumbest things that I have ever seen in manga, which is a bunch of no-name pirates deciding that this is the time to make a name for themselves by bringing down the Rocks pirates. So what these guys decide to do, right, is they think, I can take Whitebeard, Big Mom Kaido, and Shakky all at the same time. And not only that though, because just think about this. Let's say that against all odds they are successful. What happens after that? They're still on an island packed full of Marines, Holy Knights, and the Roger Pirates, and these cocky cocks think that they can survive a conflict against every global power at once. However, the saving grace of this decision is that we get a phenomenal image of Whitebeard, Big Mom Kaido, and Shakky attacking as a team, and this feels like the closest that we will ever get to seeing 4 emperors in action at the same time. Remembering that following this era, Shakky along with Whitebeard and Roger go on to become a power threesome before the 4 emperor system takes hold. It's not just them though, because we do see the rest of the relevant Rocks pirates in a fun panel later on, and if you didn't take the time to look too closely at that one, then I recommend going back, because there are some fun little Easter eggs in there. Gilbuster makes another appearance for one. However, the thing that took my eye is pretty crazy, and that was seeing Captain John in this group shot, specifically seeing him with this big chunky metal arm which looks like it was created through the Jiki Jiki no Mi, the devil fruit of one Eustace Kid. And I do struggle to come up with another explanation because it's not just a prosthetic arm. In the previous chapter, we saw Captain John sucking down some sweet, sweet alcohols and proudly displaying 2 fleshy arms. So at this point, I have to assume that Captain John was the previous user of Eustace Kid's devil fruit. But it actually may go much deeper than that, as it has been pointed out that the father of the real-life pirate William Kidd, who inspired the character of Eustace Kid, his father's name just so happened to be Captain John Kidd, who was also a pirate. So the suggestion here is that Captain John is the father of Eustace Kid, and hey, it could be true. Everyone else in the Rocks Pirates, they were having babies everywhere, so why not John? I mean, Eustace Kid is only 23 years old, so his birth would have occurred quite some time after God Valley, which we do know that John survives, and he goes on to thrive quite well in the new era. But I'm pretty on board with this idea, and Oda could be using the Rocks Pirates to subtly give us a ton of Worst Generation backstory, like how Don Marlin is suspected to have been the father of Capone Gang Beige, which does work in terms of timeline, because Beige is 42 years old, and Don Marlin was killed by that nasty Ochoku 39 years ago. Speaking of nasty Ochoku there, right there is a better reason for all of the randoms to betray the Rocks Pirates. If Ochoku was somehow able to influence the masses with some kind of master plan to get their confidence up, something to make sure that the Rocks Pirates wouldn't be returning to Hachinosu with Shakky, who would have told them everything that he did if she did come back, and retribution upon Ochoku would have been swift and brutal. And swift and brutal is also how I would describe Garp in this chapter because, mate, oh my god, wow. This is something that I could not have expected in my wildest dreams because this dude, right? He arrives and he immediately has Whitebeard, Big Mom, and Kaido running away. For most of the run of One Piece, one way I've often described the series is that in this world there are just certain characters who are effectively gods. And when you encounter one of these characters, you have no choice but to run. Like when the Worst Generation come into contact with Admiral Kizaru pre-time skip, or the Straw Hats and Big Mom in Totaland post-time skip. But back during this time, Garp was that character. And Garp further proves himself by comfortably tanking a shot of a Big Mom combination attack using Zeus and Prometheus. And that attack, which we've seen a pretty devastating variant of in the modern day, it is nothing to Garp. He just stares back at Lin Lin with that demonic smile, and her reaction is one of proper terror. Here, Garp, the D-Man, has managed to out-demon a demon. And it's also always worth remembering that Zeus was here because I keep forgetting that if there's anyone who could tell the story of God Valley to any of the Straw Hats who happen to be interested, it is definitely him. I should also point out that in fairness for Kaido, he did want to stay and fight Garp. He would have been obliterated at the time, but he did want to give it a go, so good on him. And look, maybe part of why Kaido wanted to interrupt the Paramount War so much was so that he could take a stab at a rapidly aging Garp one last time. In addition to Whitebeard, and speaking of Whitebeard, I've seen a couple of people weirded out by the idea of Whitebeard running away, and artistically, it does look strange. Because Eiichiro Oda has programmed me into thinking that this man is the strongest in the world. So it definitely feels weird to see him in this position, and many people are pointing to his iconic death scene where we see his back and the narrator says that he never sustained a single coward's wound, which some have taken as an implication that Whitebeard never ran away from anything, but I've always read it more as Whitebeard never ran from a fight with meaningful stakes on the line. For example, the Paramount War, that was a meaningful fight because Ace's life was on the line, and later on the lives of all of Whitebeard's sons. So there is absolutely no way that Whitebeard would run from that. But in this case, on God Valley, there was no meaning in staying to fight Garp. And in fact, getting caught up in a duel with Garp from Whitebeard's perspective put Shakky's life at further risk because he is delaying her rescue. So Whitebeard's not running away because he's afraid. He's running away because Garp is not the actual mission here. And Whitebeard is perfectly right to do so, because we know that at this very moment, Shakky's life is under threat. She ran into the worst possible person, Saint Summers, who I swear is going for a speed run to become the most hated character in all of the One Piece. He's quite a horrifying guy because he has that Spandam attitude but with the personal power to back it up. And in this chapter, I was getting some serious Any Slobby flashbacks with Saint Summers beating up Shakky while she was handcuffed. And I do think that I need to make an apology to Saint Summers to some degree, because while we were on Elbaf, I kept saying that I just couldn't see him as a major antagonist. But I do think that he is doing very well in this Spandam Orochi kind of role. And there is one panel in particular that I despise, but I really appreciate is there, which is this one of Saint Summers right before he's about to kill Shakky. I love when Oda does this, but what he did is he gave Summers an extra layer of shading across his face. That's important because One Piece artwork, it's usually quite flat. And part of this is because Oda doesn't like realistic drawing. He believes that it's much too difficult to create the emotions he's going for with realism, because once something is realistic, we as readers tend to scrutinize it a lot more because our eyes can tell if something is just a little bit off. But every now and then, Oda does draw his characters just one step closer to realism than usual in order to give particularly detestable characters that extra layer of uncomfortableness and to confront readers a bit by elevating them from the page, which makes it all the more satisfying when the Dark King enters and smacks Saint Summers back into the realm of 2D where he belongs. And what Rayleigh does here is actually surprisingly comical. Summers gets slammed into the wall like a cartoon, and I don't know if this is the end for Summers' involvement on God Valley, because the dude, he's just gonna regenerate any damage he received and get right back up. And I do hope we see at least a short conflict between Summers and Scopa-Gaban, just something to reinforce the PTSD that we saw activating on Elbaf. It is quite funny that both the right and left arms of the Pirate King have completely destroyed this guy though. And you know what? Maybe what we actually need is for Roger to get involved and we can make a full triptych. However, what Roger will not be getting involved in is Shakky, as this chapter has finally sealed the deal with Shakky and Silver's Rayleigh, and look, I'm pretty happy with this. I thought this was very sweet. I always get a bit nervous when Oda dips into romance, but I should trust him a lot more than I do, because stuff like Sanji and Pudding also turned out to be quite touching. I love that Rayleigh apologizes for being late, referencing the note that Shakky gave him, which is their way of saying, I love you. Neither of these characters are overtly lovey-dovey. It's very much here, hand note, here, I acknowledge note, and that's how it is. Because Oda always writes the manga with young boys in mind who realistically, they're not going to want to hear all of the love stuff, but to Oda's credit, I think that his images often say a lot more than his text ever could. Like this close-up of Shakky and the sheer amount of emotion that has been injected into her eyes. There's such a fantastic range of things happening here. There's this mixture of being happy and scared, terrified of her situation, but in awe of Rayleigh, the man that she loves, but she's kind of frustrated and sad that it took him so long to reply to her, and it's just a big mess of everything that allows both Shakky and Rayleigh to break down into tears. It is such a good ending to this world-altering side story, and I think that we should savor it because it's easy to forget, but we are in a flashback, and things do not usually work out anywhere near this well in a flashback. This feels like the kind of exhale that you would usually have after beating the main antagonist or right before we do, like that wonderful moment between Denjiro and Hiyori after Orochi had been killed, and Hiyori was finally able to stop holding in her emotions and let some tears out. And I don't think we're going to be getting a lot more of that from here on out. Maybe a bit with the salvation of Shanks, that might be another moment like this, but everything else, it feels geared towards giving us straight up pain. We know that things are not ending well for Rox Dieselbeck, nor the rest of the Rox pirates themselves, who are going to be fragmented, hurt in their own ways, and go off to become the twisted monsters they evolve into, except for Whitebeard, who becomes the best dad ever. And even after we dealt with all of that, then we've got to get to the tragedy of King Harold. So what we do have is a fairly clear setup for what's coming next. We're shown a mini-map, which by the way, that's weird as well. Seeing a mini-map in a flashback, that's how you know that this is a serious flashback. But the mini-map shows Roger and Rox on a collision course, along with the world nobles evacuating to the side. And look, I still don't know what sparks the conflict between Rox and Roger, if there even is one, if our knowledge of this event is accurate, because Rox just wants to save his family, and Roger seems to just want some treasure at this stage and to get the crap out of there. And I imagine that if Roger is heading to this central point, then so is Dragon, and so he's going to make a deposit in a treasure chest, a baby deposit, so that Roger can take it away. But do you know who we didn't see in this chapter? Someone very suspiciously absent? That would be Gunko. We have no idea where she is right now, and if there's anyone who can make a couple of guys who are not necessarily enemies into enemies, then it is Imu through Gunko. So I'm quite worried for wherever she's lurking, and all I know is that whatever happens next week, I will not be ready for it. But you let me know what you think in the comments below.